The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine lawns of Windsor Castle, but inside the grand corridors, tension hung thick in the air, like fog on the Thames. Prince William strode purposefully through the marble hallways, his footsteps echoing with an urgency that made the household staff pause in their duties. His jaw was set tight, and his normally composed demeanor had given way to something far more volatile. Catherine had been home for 3 days now, recovering from what the palace had officially termed a minor health concern. But William knew the truth was far more complex and troubling. His wife, the future Queen of England, had been pushed to her breaking point, and the culprit was someone who should have been her greatest ally within the royal family. The incident that sparked this crisis had occurred during a private family gathering the previous week. What was meant to be a quiet dinner to discuss upcoming royal engagements had turned into a battlefield of subtle insults and deliberate slights. Camilla, the queen consort, had systematically undermined Catherine throughout the evening, questioning her decisions about the children's education, criticizing her choice of charities, and making pointed comments about her common background that had left the entire room in uncomfortable silence. William had watched his wife's face grow paler with each barbed comment, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for her water glass. Catherine had maintained her composure with the grace that had made her beloved by the British public, but William could see the toll it was taking. When Camilla had made a particularly cruel remark about Catherine's family's business background, comparing it unfavorably to proper royal breeding, something inside William had snapped. The confrontation that followed had been swift but devastating. William had politely but firmly asked for a private word with his stepmother, and what transpired behind closed doors had left both of them shaken. Camilla had emerged red-faced and defensive, while William looked like a man who had finally reached the end of his patience. Now, 3 days later, Catherine remained at home, claiming she needed time to rest. But William knew she was struggling with something deeper than fatigue. The woman who had faced down crowds of thousands, who had represented the crown with dignity across the globe, was retreating from public life because of treatment she was receiving from within her own family. The palace corridors seemed to whisper with gossip as William made his way to his father's private study. King Charles had requested this meeting, undoubtedly to discuss the growing tension that threatened to spill into the public eye. The monarchy had survived scandals before, but internal family conflicts always posed the greatest threat to their carefully maintained image of unity and stability. As William paused outside the heavy oak doors of his father's study, he could hear voices from within. Camilla was already there, her distinctive laugh carrying through the thick walls. The sound only fueled his anger further. While Catherine was at home, struggling with the emotional aftermath of the constant criticism and undermining, Camilla was here, likely spinning her version of events to gain sympathy and support. William knocked firmly and entered without waiting for permission. The scene before him was exactly what he had expected. King Charles sat behind his massive mahogany desk, looking older than his years, while Camilla occupied the chair beside him, her hand resting possessively on the armrest. Her expression shifted from surprise to wariness as she saw the determined look on William's face. The king looked up from the papers scattered across his desk, his expression weary but hopeful that this meeting might resolve the growing crisis. He had been caught in an impossible position, torn between his loyalty to his wife and his love for his son. The palace staff had already begun to whisper about the tension, and several royal correspondents had started asking probing questions about Catherine's recent absence from public engagements. Camilla straightened in her chair, her chin lifting with the defiance that had become her trademark whenever she felt threatened. She had worked too hard to establish her position within the royal family to let anyone, even her stepson, undermine her authority. In her mind, Catherine was still the outsider who had married into the family, while she was the king's wife and rightful queen consort. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken accusations and years of carefully suppressed resentment. William remained standing, his hands clasped behind his back in a gesture that reminded everyone present of his military training and natural authority. This was no longer the young prince who had once accepted Camilla's presence in his life for the sake of his father's happiness. This was the future King of England, and he was done tolerating behavior that threatened his family's well-being. Outside the study windows, the ancient oak trees swayed in the autumn wind, their branches scraping against the glass like fingers trying to claw their way inside. The sound seemed to underscore the gravity of the moment, as 3 generations of the royal family prepared for a confrontation that would determine the future dynamics of the monarchy itself. William's phone buzzed quietly in his pocket, and he knew without looking that it was another message from Catherine, probably apologizing for not feeling well enough to attend another royal function. The guilt and sadness in her recent messages had been breaking his heart, and he was determined that this pattern would end today, regardless of the consequences. The morning light streaming through the tall windows seemed to illuminate the battle lines that had been drawn within the royal family, lines that had been invisible to the public but painfully clear to those living within the palace walls. The tension in the room reached a breaking point as William finally spoke, his voice low but carrying the unmistakable authority of someone who would not be ignored. King Charles looked between his son and his wife, sensing that whatever happened in the next few minutes would forever change the delicate balance they had maintained within the family. William began by recounting the events of the previous week, his words measured but filled with barely controlled anger. He detailed each slight, each cutting remark, each moment when Camilla had deliberately tried to make Catherine feel unwelcome and inadequate. As he spoke, Camilla's expression grew increasingly defensive, her hands clenching in her lap as she prepared to justify her actions. The future king described how he had watched his wife's confidence erode over months of subtle but persistent criticism. Catherine, who had entered the royal family with enthusiasm and genuine desire to serve, had begun to second-guess every decision she made. The woman who had once handled state dinners and international visits with natural grace was now questioning whether she deserved her place in the family. King Charles listened in growing dismay as William painted a picture of systematic emotional manipulation that had been happening right under his nose. The monarch had always prided himself on his ability to read people and situations, but he had been blind to the campaign of psychological warfare being waged against his daughter-in-law. The realization that his own wife might be responsible for Catherine's recent struggles hit him like a physical blow. Camilla could no longer remain silent as William's accusations mounted. She rose from her chair, her voice sharp with indignation as she began her defense. In her version of events, she had simply been trying to help Catherine understand the realities of royal life. The suggestions about the children's education had been based on decades of experience with royal protocol. Her comments about Catherine's background had been meant to help her appreciate the unique position she now held, but William was not buying these explanations. His voice rose as he confronted Camilla directly, pointing out the pattern of behavior that went far beyond helpful advice. He had witnessed too many moments when Camilla had deliberately chosen words designed to wound, had seen too many occasions when she had undermined Catherine's authority in front of staff and other family members. The confrontation escalated as Camilla defended her position with increasing desperation. She had worked for years to overcome public skepticism about her role in the royal family, and she was not about to let her stepson diminish her hard-won status. Her voice grew shrill as she accused William of being overly protective and unable to accept constructive criticism of his wife. King Charles found himself in the impossible position of mediating between the 2 most important people in his life. His love for Camilla was genuine and deep, born from years of shared struggle and mutual support. But his relationship with William was equally precious, built on a foundation of respect that had grown stronger since his accession to the throne. The thought of having to choose between them filled him with dread. The argument reached its crescendo when William revealed the full extent of Catherine's current state. He described finding his wife in tears after royal events, watching her lose weight from stress, and seeing her withdraw from activities she had once loved. The strong, confident woman the public admired was crumbling under the constant pressure of never being good enough for Camilla's impossible standards. The revelation that Catherine had been seriously considering stepping back from her royal duties entirely sent shockwaves through the room. King Charles understood immediately what this would mean for the monarchy. Catherine was one of their most popular members, beloved by the British public and respected internationally. Her withdrawal would not only be a personal tragedy for the family, but a disaster for the institution they all served. Camilla's defense began to crumble as the full impact of her behavior became clear. She had convinced herself that her actions were justified, that she was protecting the royal family's standards and traditions. But faced with the possibility that her treatment of Catherine might force the future Princess of Wales to retreat from public life, even she began to question whether she had gone too far. The study fell silent except for the ticking of the ancient grandfather clock in the corner, its steady rhythm marking the seconds as each person in the room grappled with the magnitude of the crisis. Outside, the palace continued its daily routine, unaware that the very foundation of the royal family's future was being decided behind closed doors. William's phone buzzed again, and this time he pulled it out to read the message. His expression softened as he read Catherine's words, but his jaw tightened with renewed determination. She was apologizing again, this time for missing a charity event that had been important to her. The woman who should have been confidently leading royal engagements was instead hiding at home, convinced that she was a disappointment to everyone around her. King Charles watched his son's face and realized that this crisis had reached a point where half measures would no longer suffice. The delicate diplomatic approach he had hoped might resolve the tension was clearly inadequate for the depth of the problem. Something more dramatic would be required to save both his family and the institution they served. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the study as the three members of the royal family faced the reality that their relationships with each other would never be the same. The careful balance they had maintained was shattered, and whatever emerged from this confrontation would determine not just their personal happiness, but the future stability of the British monarchy itself. The silence that followed William's last words seemed to stretch forever, broken only by the distant sound of palace staff going about their duties in the corridors beyond. King Charles sat forward in his chair, his hands clasped tightly together as he processed everything his son had revealed. The weight of the crown had never felt heavier than it did in this moment, as he realized he faced a choice that could tear his family apart. Camilla had sunk back into her chair, her earlier defiance replaced by a dawning understanding of how serious the situation had become. For the first time, she began to see her actions through William's eyes, and the picture that emerged was far different from the helpful guidance she had convinced herself she was providing. The woman who had fought so hard for acceptance within the royal family was confronting the possibility that her behavior might cost the monarchy one of its most valuable members. William remained standing, his posture rigid with barely controlled emotion. He had laid out his case as clearly and forcefully as he could, and now he waited for his father to respond. The future of his marriage, his wife's well-being, and quite possibly the stability of the royal family itself hung in the balance. He thought of Catherine at home, probably sitting in their private garden with a book she was not really reading, convincing herself that she was somehow failing in her duty to the crown. King Charles finally broke the silence, his voice heavy with the weight of his words. He acknowledged that he had failed to see what was happening under his own roof, and that his blindness to the situation had allowed it to escalate to a crisis point. The king, who had spent his entire life preparing to protect the monarchy, was forced to confront the reality that the greatest threat to its future was coming from within his own family. The conversation that followed was unlike anything that had ever taken place within the ancient walls of Windsor Castle. King Charles spoke with the authority of the crown, but the vulnerability of a father and husband caught between impossible loyalties. He made it clear that Catherine was not just William's wife, but a crucial member of the royal family whose well-being was essential to their collective success. Camilla was forced to confront the full scope of her behavior and its impact. The king's words were gentle but firm as he helped her understand that her actions, regardless of their intended purpose, had crossed lines that could not be ignored. The woman who had spent years building her reputation as a dedicated royal consort was faced with the possibility that her treatment of Catherine might undo everything she had worked to achieve. The discussion moved beyond accusations and defenses to focus on practical solutions. William made it clear that Catherine's return to full royal duties depended on fundamental changes in how she was treated within the family. The subtle undermining, the constant criticism, and the deliberate attempts to make her feel inferior had to stop completely and permanently. King Charles took the unprecedented step of establishing new protocols for family interactions, making it clear that any behavior that threatened the well-being of family members would not be tolerated. The informal hierarchy that had allowed Camilla to position herself above Catherine was formally restructured, with clear guidelines about respect and mutual support. The most powerful moment came when William described Catherine's actual contributions to the royal family and the monarchy. He detailed her popularity with the British public, her successful international diplomatic efforts, and her genuine commitment to the causes she supported. The picture he painted was of a woman who had brought immense value to the institution, making Camilla's attempts to diminish her seem not just cruel, but strategically foolish. Camilla's response marked a turning point in the crisis. Whether motivated by genuine remorse, recognition of the damage she had caused, or simple self-preservation, she began to acknowledge the harm her actions had inflicted. The queen consort, who had entered the room, confident in her position, left with a clear understanding that her future within the royal family depended on her ability to change her behavior completely. The practical arrangements that emerged from this confrontation were as important as the emotional healing. King Charles mandated that future family gatherings would follow specific protocols designed to prevent any repetition of the harmful dynamics. Camilla would be required to publicly support Catherine's initiatives and to treat her with the respect due to the future Queen of England. Most significantly, King Charles made it clear that Catherine's well-being was now a matter of royal priority. Any attempt to undermine her confidence or authority would be viewed as an attack on the monarchy itself. The message was unmistakable. Catherine was not just tolerated within the royal family, she was essential to its future success. The resolution of the immediate crisis came with William's phone call to Catherine, made from his father's study with both the king and Camilla present. The conversation was brief but emotional, with William assuring his wife that the situation had been addressed and that she had the full support of the crown. For the first time in months, Catherine's voice carried a note of genuine relief rather than forced cheerfulness. The weeks that followed saw a dramatic transformation in the dynamics within the royal family. Camilla's public interactions with Catherine became noticeably warmer and more supportive, while private family gatherings took on a completely different tone. The changes were subtle enough to avoid public speculation, but significant enough to restore Catherine's confidence and enthusiasm for her royal duties. The crisis that had threatened to tear the royal family apart ultimately strengthened their bonds by forcing them to confront problems that had been allowed to fester for too long. King Charles emerged as a stronger leader, having demonstrated his willingness to make difficult decisions to protect the integrity of the monarchy. William's fierce defense of his wife established him as a force to be reckoned with. while Catherine's eventual return to full royal duties was marked by a new confidence and authority. The palace walls that had trembled with conflict eventually settled into a new stability, one built on clear boundaries, mutual respect, and the understanding that the strength of the monarchy depended on the unity and well-being of all its members. The lessons learned in that sun-dappled study would echo through the corridors of power for years to come, ensuring that such a crisis would never again threaten the institution they all served.